The use of the term salvation in our opening words may have been uncomfortable for some of you. That's okay. I want to talk more about human salvation, creative maladjustment, and how we do any of that. In this context, and in much of Dr. King's work, when he talks about salvation, he's actually not speaking in the usual Christian frame. He's not talking about salvation after death. He's talking about us being saved here and now. He's talking about saving the world, which might feel a little more comfortable for you. He's talking about keeping our humanity and restoring the full humanity of all other humans. Human salvation, human capacity to save the world, humanness relies on the creatively maladjusted. We're going to spend some time dipping into Christian language today, and I'll do my best to explain it in a context that makes sense for us. But it's impossible to get into Dr. King's work without dealing with Christianity, because he was a Christian. He was not the kind of Christian so focused on the next life that he thinks that this one doesn't matter. Quite the opposite, in fact. Dr. King speaks rarely of a next life, and often, consistently, of this life and of the promise and potential of what he would call beloved community. In September of 1967, right here in Washington, D.C., Dr. King gave a lesser-known address to the American Psychological Association. He talked to them about how he felt they were doing great work in helping people become better adjusted to the world around them, but had some questions about what exactly it meant to be adjusted to a society like the one they found themselves in. He said, "I am sure that we will recognize that there are some things in our society, some things in our world to which we should never be adjusted. We must never adjust ourselves to racial discrimination or racial segregation. We must never adjust ourselves to religious bigotry. We must never adjust ourselves to economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. We must never adjust ourselves to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence." Dr. King would go on to speak about creative maladjustment several times, even suggesting the establishment for a society for creative maladjustment. I would like to suggest that on the list of things that we might be is a society for creative maladjustment. He referenced this concept again when when he gave the WES lecture, which is a named lecture at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, given variously by Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, Dr. King, Kurt Vonnegut, and a number of other people that you would have been lucky to get to see speak. His WES lecture in 1966 was titled, "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution." Dr. King says, "Stay woke, y'all." He recounted the story of Rip Van Winkle, right? Rip Van Winkle, who goes up into the mountains and falls asleep for 20 years. How many of you have ever wanted to fall asleep for 20 years? I would like to, right now. Yeah. Yeah. 4 would do, yeah. So, in this time that Rip Van Winkle is asleep, the American Revolution happens. There's a little piece of the story that is often not told, that when he goes up the hill, he goes by a portrait of King George, and when he comes back, he goes by a portrait of George Washington and does not know who that is. Dr. King then asks, what do we do when we find ourselves in a revolutionary time? Dr. King certainly found himself in one type of revolutionary time, and we find ourselves in maybe another. He asks specifically what, and I'm going to use the word he uses and then expand, what the churches should do. Now, he's speaking to Unitarian Universalists in 1966, Unitarian Universalists who are only 5 years out from being Unitarian Christians and Universalist Christians. Unitarian Universalists who won't stop giving communion regularly until 1970. So churches make sense in the context he's in, but I think it expands out. I think what he says churches should do speaks to what congregations should do, what communities should do. Whatever we call the places we go to realign ourselves with our moral and ethical centers, the places we go to connect with one another and be enlarged and enlivened by one another's presence. What should we do? He says first that we are challenged to instill within the people in our congregations a world perspective. That this world that we live in is geographically one. Consider he's saying this in 1966, when the world is not nearly so close together as it is now. He illustrates his point, in fact, by going over a Bob Hope bit about how you could take a flight from Los Angeles to New York and you could hiccup and you could hic in LA and up in New York. Consider that we are so close together that if you are online, you could hic any old place and up around the world if you wanted to. We need to remember, and I think one of the things we do well here is remembering that the world is geographically one place. That there is actually no us and them. That no matter some people's obsessive focus on a border, those are just lines we drew. They are not real. A person's humanity does not cease or begin at a line we drew on some paper. No matter how many fences we put there and how many guns and bombs we use to defend it. Secondly, he says, it is necessary for congregations to reaffirm over and over again the essential immorality of racial segregation. This building is special for a number of reasons, and not just because we come here. This building is special because we built it here so that it could be built by unionized and integrated work crews. This building is special because we built it here so that it could easily be an integrated community. J. Edgar Hoover thought we were communists. J. Edgar Hoover thought we were communists and were a communist front for two equally ridiculous reasons. One being that we had a pavlova party at which we ate pavlovas, which are in fact a Russian dessert, but it's a big meringue, friend. Yeah. But the second and more intense reason that J. Edgar Hoover thought we were communists was that we regularly had integrated conversations about race in this building. They say that the most segregated day of the week is Sunday morning. That continues to be true. As we move into this new era in our country, this replaying of an old era in our country and in the world, we have to remember that history, and we have to remember to live into the promise that our ancestors made. The promise that is George Beecham and Maceo's great aunt and Thurgood Marshall working on Brown versus Board of Education together, and doing some of that work, not in this building because they hadn't quite built it yet, but doing that work here in this city despite the risks. Dr. King also says that it's necessary to refute the idea that there are superior and inferior races. And I want to take that and blow it out big, though focusing on racial justice is important. We have to get rid of the idea that there are superior and inferior people. That anybody is anything less than or more than just somebody. That there are better cultures, there are less damaging cultures, right? That there are any people that there is nothing to learn from, that there are any people who are fundamentally unworthy. We live in a world shaped by an obsession with hierarchy. An obsession with hierarchy that people insist is true and enact a lot of violence to keep in place. An obsession with hierarchy that tells us that white people are better and black people are worse, and people of all other shades sit somewhere in the middle, depending on how we feel that day. That says that men are better than women in necessary and inescapable ways. That straight people are better than gay people, that cis people are better than trans people, that able-bodied people are better than disabled people, that, well, in age it becomes complicated, that there is some perfect age in the middle where you are not too young or too old, but correct. That age doesn't seem to exist. And interestingly, being white correctly, being a man correctly, being straight correctly, being cis correctly, being able-bodied correctly also doesn't exist. Dr. Thurman would say that the measure of a man's belief about your ability is found in the kinds of weapons he thinks it is appropriate to use to keep you in a fixed place. We see that all the time. If women are necessarily lesser than men, why did we only start having gender-segregated sports when women started beating men at them? If white people are necessarily better than black people, why did white people find it necessary to hold black people in bondage for so long, and when no longer allowed to do that in the first way that they did it, to find again and again and again new ways to denigrate and segregate and disenfranchise black populations? If straight people are naturally so much better than gay people, if it is normal and the only way it should be for people to be straight and cisgendered, why are you so scared that your kids might know that people are gay? Not you. I think you are pretty clear that it's okay for your kids to know that someone is gay, it would be a weird choice to come here. And yet, in this section, Dr. King talks about Christian theologian Paul Tillich and his idea about sin. And here we are running into another one of those complicated words, sin. What could sin possibly be if there's not a hell to go to? And how could that be a useful concept? How could that be a useful concept, in fact, when a number of people, the people who claim that they have a unique and special right to call themselves religious, to call themselves moral, have been running around calling all manner of ordinary difference sin? Well, Tillich wrote about sin as separation, as turning away. And though Tillich and King might have a concept of God that they mean you're turning away from, in practice, sin for them was whatever turned you away from other people. Whatever turned you away from the real suffering of the person next to you or across the globe. Whatever made you feel detached from the network of everything which is so interconnected. I think there's a useful framework of sin in there for us, though we may never come to use that word with any frequency, and I'm cool with that. We need to make sure that we are practicing turning towards. It's really easy in contexts like ours to do something that's called apophatic theology. That is, theology that says, not this. It is, in fact, one of the big criticisms of calling something atheism. It simply tells you what you're not, right? It's very easy to say what you don't believe in a world full of people loudly announcing really awful beliefs. Not that, not that, not that. So if we move from Tillich's idea of sin as turning away to a positive theology, and I'm calling it theology, whatever we feel about that theo word at the beginning, we're going to leave that aside for today. We'll come back to it. Not today. So if we say what we do believe in then, right? If what we believe is bad, if we agree that turning away is bad, turning towards is good. And there are a lot of ways to turn towards. There are ways that are interpersonal and relatively simple. Things like waiting about half an hour between when you write the angry email and when you decide to send an email. Because sometimes you're mad in the moment, and half an hour later, you're fine, and you can communicate what you wanted to communicate without the heat and aggression that it first came to you in. And you can have a better conversation with someone who is not your enemy, who is just irritating. Right? Part of turning towards is realizing that we are all irritating. Everybody is glorious and wonderful and interesting and so irritated. So we can turn towards each other past our irritations. We can turn towards each other past gaps in taste, right? We don't have to like the same things to be able to say, I see that you like that thing and it means something to you, so I'm interested, tell me more. We can turn towards each other in our workplaces by finding creative ways to respond to weird stuff that people say. And that doesn't mean you don't have to tell them that it's weird. But When somebody comes to you and says something strange, whether that something strange is just, what? Or it is offensive, actually. You can say, can you say more about what you mean by that? If somebody tells you a joke that clearly relies on a negative stereotype to be funny, this is a really fun game, and this is a particularly fun game to play if you're a woman, just to say, I don't understand. I don't get it. Playing dumb has a lot of efficacy in causing people to tell on themselves. And then, if they've said it, Other helpful phrases include, that was a weird thing to say out loud. Are you sure you didn't mean to think that? Humor is, it turns out, quite powerful. We can turn towards each other also by building our relationships, building them here by learning to identify our feelings and ways of communicating. And there's a wide range of stuff that can be helpful with that. Things like feelings wheels, which help us identify exactly what feelings we are having. Because we never actually learn, most of us, to identify what feelings we're having. We mostly learn to stop having the feeling. Unless, of course, the feeling is joy, in which case we just learn to mediate it so it's not uncomfortable for other people. Things like nonviolent communication, which are complicated but useful tools. And I want you to know that starting on February 9th, when we'll celebrate Pay Attention to Love Day, we'll also begin having relationship building courses here at WES again. Another way we can turn towards each other is through social action or ethical action in partnership with other people. We can move into the arena of social action, and in fact, that is one of those things that Dr. King suggests congregations must do. He says, the law cannot make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important also. And so while the law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. We find ourselves in a somewhat lawless era. It is a little hard to trust that the institutions we have are worth putting energy into. However, some of us, and I know some of you, are institutionalists. Some of us really know how to work the phones, work our connections with elected folks. And I'm just going to tell you what my note under this says. It says, stay on the asses. And I mean that. If your work is legislative, if your work is writing a letter to your congressperson or your senator or your governor or whoever you've got, depending on where you live, do it, and do it all the time. If your work is connecting people to something that they can do, do it, and do it all the time. If your work is providing direct care, particularly if it's providing direct care to marginalized folks, do that and do it all the time. If your work is raising children, and that is important, fundamental, vital work, do it. And know that if you can't show up at every other thing because you've got a smaller person who needs your time, that is okay. Not just okay, that is good. Here, I want us to find ways to do social action together in public, but I do not want us to ever do it alone. I want us to reach out to all of the people and organizations in this area, and there are so many, who are aligned with us in values. Particularly, I want to see us work closely with HIPS. HIPS, which is a former addict and sex worker run harm reduction organization which provides Narcan, clean syringes, condoms, and a wide array of other resources, particularly for our neighbors who live on the street. I want us to find the organizations of unhoused folks and follow their lead. I want us to be more connected with the Washington Interfaith Network and to find ways to establish and deepen our connections with the Piscataway people, who are the indigenous folks of this land. Dr. King then returns to this idea of creative maladjustment. He says, "Yes, I must confess that I believe firmly that our world is in dire need of a new organization, the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment, the Washington Creative Maladjustment Society." He also speaks at length in this piece about the love ethic and nonviolent resistance. He goes a little far into the Christian ideas of redemptive suffering for my taste. He's really convinced at this time that people will witness suffering and change their minds. That if you just suffer and keep loving your oppressor, not in an affectionate way, but in a familial way, that they will come to have sympathy and change their minds. I am left with my own struggle around nonviolence as an ethos. Kwame Ture, who was one of the original freedom riders and later a popular leader in the Black Panthers, is noted as having said, "Dr. King's policy was that nonviolence would achieve the gains for Black people in the United States. His major assumption was that if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and he will be moved to change his heart." That's very good. He only made one fallacious assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none. Beyond not having a conscience, I think much of the soon-to-be United States government has an active desire to see people suffering, an active desire to cause suffering in other people. You can see a little bit of where this is heading in right-wing commentators suddenly having a big problem with ASL interpretation. It is now too woke to include people who can't hear. You can see it in the resurgence of the R word, a particularly nasty slur for people with developmental disabilities that I thought we had left in the 90s. But you hear it more and more, and then if you are paying attention, you see what is in fact a genocidal impulse towards disabled people. A desire to remove care, remove consideration, and take disabled people out of the public sphere entirely. We know where that goes. We know where that goes. They know where that goes. It is hard for me to believe in nonviolence when I feel so scared. It is hard for anyone to believe in nonviolence when they feel so scared. And let me be clear before I begin this next section that I do still think you should punch a Nazi. I do still think you should punch a Nazi, but Rabbi Dana Rutenberg writes a blog called Life is a Sacred Text, and in November released an extensive piece titled On Organizing, Some First Steps for This Journey. In it, she refers to political scientists Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephen, who collected data on all major violent and nonviolent campaigns for the overthrow of a government or territorial liberation since 1900. In the whole world, anywhere where there were at least 1,000 known participants. After combing through hundreds of cases, they found that only a quarter of the violent revolutions achieved their aims, while more than half of the nonviolent ones did. And they found that those using nonviolent means were more likely to end with a democracy than those who used violent methods, were more likely to wind up with just another form of tyranny. They picked only huge resistance campaigns that sought to either secede, expel a foreign occupier, or overthrow a head of state. So the civil rights movement did not count because they were only seeking reforms. And they only labeled movements successful if they won within a year of their peak activity, which means that Gandhi's campaign in India also didn't count because it took the Brits too long to leave. Story of the world. Even with all of those really strict limitations, over half of the nonviolent resistant movements they looked at were a success. More than half of the time, a nonviolent resistance movement toppled an unjust regime within a year. That has me on my heels. I still don't think that the United States has a conscience. I think that our government has, in fact, and I hesitate to even use this word this way, sadistic approach towards its people. I am clear that the people who are caught up in Donald Trump, in making America great again, wish to subjugate other people to escape having to deal with their own sense of failure and insufficiency. To deal with that, they are not what they think they should be, that they do not get to occupy this high place of power that they think they are owed. And more than half the time, a nonviolent resistance movement toppled an unjust regime within a year. Chenoweth and Stephen found some commonalities among the successful movements. And two of the most important ones are a large and diverse population of participants that continue to grow both in size and diversity and can be sustained over time. They call it the 3.5% rule. Everywhere they looked, where a nonviolent resistance campaign engaged the active and sustained participation of at least 3.5% of that nation's population, they won. 3.5 is not a big percentage, but is a large number in a country as big as this. But the way that you get to active and sustained participation is through connection, right? Rabbi Rutenberg talks a little bit about how online organizing has kind of confused a large chunk of society about what is really needed to sustain movement. Because online organizing pitches up when something is hot and then devolves into infighting in about 5 seconds after the protest is over, if not while the protest is happening. Real community, and I don't negate the internet's possibility for community, but real community that isn't just about showing off how right you are. Real community that is about staying together, about commitment to one another's real, full aliveness and safety and growth. That sustains a movement. That keeps people together and alive and going. It lets some people step up and other people step back so that they can rest. It lets people take on different roles as their bodies and lives change, as their needs and abilities change. One of the other widely overlooked elements they identified was a creative and imaginative variation in methods of resistance beyond mass protest. Marches are not enough. Public actions are not enough. Strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, guerrilla theater, ritual protests, integration with art, banging pots and pans, wild and even hilarious shenanigans. Anything that will mess things up and move things along. So I encourage you to go to marches if that makes sense for you. To write letters if that makes sense for you. But here, at the Washington Society for Creative Maladjustment, I'm going to call it a whole bunch of things now. Here, let's think about what we can do that is disruptive and creative. What kinds of public art we can make that shake things up. We have a unique stage here on 16th Street. We have a unique stage here in Washington, D.C. What can we do that is loud and creative, compelling and beautiful, and also really irritating to the people we need it to irritate? I know within you, you all have tremendous capacity to be both creative and irritating. Me too. So I want us to focus on what we can do in that realm. And I want us to focus on our relationships. As part of focusing on relationship with other communities, on February 8th, wow, this is a busy weekend I'm talking about. On February 8th, WES will join with Farbrengen, a synagogue which rents from us, and Ilma, which is a Muslim center that also rents from us, to have an inter-community dialogue and meal. We all meet for our services in this building. We all share this space, and we all share the reality of being religious minorities in a world increasingly hostile to religious minorities. So I invite you, when the email goes out, to sign up to come, to bring some food to share and to meet these members of our community. We don't believe the same things, but we have similar values. We are culturally quite different. But we have such shared values and such shared location. This is one of those places that we can start. My last note before I wrap this up, because I have been talking for too long. Do not obey in advance. Do not obey in advance. There are things that you know are coming. Don't do them before somebody makes you. Make them force you. You don't have to put your body at risk if that doesn't feel like something you want to do. But don't give up before they've even asked. I am seeing all around in papers of record, in what I think of as the legacy media, in our elected officials, just a rolling over, a readiness to work with, a preemptive removal of all DEI, of all references to LGBT people. Don't do it. Do not acquiesce in advance. And if you get arrested, we'll get you out. I'll find the money. Hear me? Before I go sit down, I'm going to introduce our platform response music. Our response song today is Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is also known as the Black National Anthem. I'm introducing it for two important reasons. One, to not contextualize Lift Every Voice and Sing as a song particularly important to Black America, and then have it sung by our predominantly white chorus, would be to ignore that there is a gap, right? And we want to honor that. The other reason is that there is a full verse about God, and we didn't take it out. We didn't take it out because the song that Black folks sing in their churches, when people get sworn in, at baseball games sometimes, the Black National Anthem talks about God. We live in a world amongst many people who believe in God in literal and less literal ways. So we're going to sing the song as it's written. And maybe it's going to be uncomfortable. And we're going to be okay with that. And if we need to process some feelings about the words, we're going to talk to our clergy person and our friends later. I love you. We're going to find some ways through this.